Hey everybody, today I'm going to be talking about my favorite films of the last 10 years, the last decade, and look, I mean, this list was not fun to put together because that's a lot of movies to think about and to go through, and some of them I had to rewatch because I hadn't seen them in years to see if they still hold up, so it's complicated. This is like, it's kind of stressful. But I have created a little list here. It's not a top 5, it's not a top 10. I don't even know how many movies are on here. Just a little list of movies that I came up with, and movies that really influenced me, that inspired me, ones that are complex and really hold up with repeated viewings, things like that are what I'm looking for. These are in no particular order except for the last one. I always do this. I talk about all my favorite films, but I leave my very favorite one for last. I'm gonna try to go through these semi-quickly and we'll see how that works, but let's get into it. My first film is Holy Motors, and this came out in 2012, and it was directed by Leos Carax. I really like movies that are about the very act of making movies, not necessarily movies that take place in Hollywood, but movies that are about the idea of what film can be, film as an illusion, all of that, and that's what this movie's about. It's about film and how it is a certain language. It's deconstructing the very nature of cinema and of cinema structure, but it's from a critic's perspective. Because Leos Carax did kind of begin in film criticism, and that sort of insight can really help you when you're trying to make a film like this one, because you think about that stuff a lot as a critic. You think a lot about the way things work. In this movie, I mean, it's really hard to talk about plot because there's really not a plot. Nothing adds up. Nothing really makes sense in terms of logic. This movie is, in a sense, studying manipulation, the act of manipulating, which is what film does, obviously, to elicit a certain response. And he's using allusions to sort of comment on the essence of film. And he's also jumbling the structure, kind of inverting it so that we can examine it in a different way. A lot of times when people do that, it feels very grim and dystopian, and while this is a dark film, more an aesthetic, I don't think it's a negative film at all. Actually, I think it's quite a positive look at illusions and how they can evolve into something new and exciting. It's saying, yes, things are changing, they're evolving, and a lot of what we appreciated about film in the past is no longer relevant anymore. But at the same time, it's never going to completely die. Like the idea of a story being presented in some sort of way. Yeah, of course, certain mediums can die out and become more novelties, but the art itself is always going to live on, and there are always going to be ways of expressing that through some sort of narrative in some way. It's just that way is changing, and there will be new ways of expressing that depth and that personal examination. And there's something about that I find to be really beautiful, because this film, while there's a bittersweetness to it, it's also a celebration of art and film and just expression in general. And I don't know, there's something very liberating about watching a movie like this. There are sequences in it that are just so breathtakingly beautiful. Some of the most unforgettable that I've seen in the last decade, for sure. And when I walk out of it, I'm left feeling surprisingly very touched and very moved. And I feel okay about the world, despite some of the melancholy tone of this movie, really examining that mortality. The motion capture sequence is one of my favorite, because it does kind of have that coldness to it, that sterile quality of the modern day and CGI and all of that, the things that we have to do in order to create all of these things in modern movies. And yet there's some sort of performance art quality to that. I love the scene, I guess it's more of like the intermission, it's that accordion scene where he's playing the accordion, all of a sudden all the other accordion players join in and you have a whole band. I love it because it means absolutely nothing, and yet it's just a celebration. These people are reveling in their art and in their expression. It's so simple and meaningless, and yet it brings me to tears every time. So I highly, highly recommend it, especially for people that are huge cinephiles, because it's special. Next, I'm going to be talking about Certified Copy, and this film was directed by Abbas Kiarostami. I had to revisit this one because I hadn't seen it in a number of years, though I had seen it multiple times in the past, but it always stuck with me as something that I knew I would have to return to at some point. Revisiting it this time, I had a very, very different response to it. Or I should say my relationship with it definitely changed, and either I've changed or the movie itself is really that complex, and I think it's a mix of both. But what I do know is this movie is extremely complex, so complex in fact that I don't know if I'm smart enough for it. There's still a lot that I'm trying to pick apart and understand. When I was younger, I kept emphasizing the narrative of it and trying to figure out where it was going in a more logical sense, because this movie has a very strange narrative that is constantly shifting. You have two main characters at the center of the story, and you're constantly trying to figure out what their relationship is to each other. Either it seems either they are two people that have never met, and they decide they're mistaken for a married couple, so they decide to play along, and they create this whole story that they've been married for 15 years and they're on their anniversary. Or they actually are married this entire time, and that truth gets revealed more as the movie develops, but you don't see it right away. And I remember being just fixated on that idea, and I think part of it was because that's where a lot of the discussions were coming from at the time in regards to this movie. But for me, I kind of thought that was the key, that was the that you had to figure that part out to be able to understand the proposed thesis that is at the beginning of the movie. And it's that whole idea of, like original art versus copies, and the meaning, the value of them. But now, returning to it this last time, I have to say that actually was one of the least interesting things about the film. Not to say that it's not interesting, it's just that there's so much more going on that I found myself kind of neglecting that aspect of it. And I think when you look at it just as that, as an either or, I think you're missing a lot of other potential possibilities that the movie's going for. But I think you can easily get fixated on that, where the whole idea is just a conceit. That's revealing the thesis in a very black and white sort of way. Yeah, no, this film is, I kept thinking as I was watching The Word, I kept thinking it was rich. It's just rich, authentic. It has so much in it, in every line, in every mannerism, in every shot. It reminds me a little bit of Richard Linklater's Before and After trilogy. But yet it's far more ambitious, far more layered. And I have to say, it's trippy as shit. And I know maybe some people might not think about this movie as particularly trippy, but it is the more that you watch it, I think. Because if you really start thinking about it, it is this very strange puzzle, very abstract. And as I said, the narrative, you're always trying to figure out because it's constantly shifting into something. It's almost like being in a dream. Like a lot of times when you dream, you'll be either in your house or maybe your family house. Sometimes you'll be in a house that you don't recognize, and you walk around in it and it seems like the layout is constantly shifting. That's a particular type of dream that reveals a certain psychology or like a mental state, typically a stressful state. But that's how this film feels in terms of the way that the characters are speaking, what they're revealing about themselves to each other and to us. But through it all, they are exploring the facets of perception, and particularly through art, because really, it's about that, the thesis of art and what it means. And they're discovering it through their own relationship and also with interactions from other people. It's exploring the idea of truth versus facades. But there's so much that they're talking about, and I could go on for hours and hours about this for real. But it's also combining kind of that surrealist aspect of filmmaking, where the concept of time and logic just don't seem to matter, very similarly to Holy Motors. There are nods to filmmakers of the past, like Louis Buñuel, and they do that in a very cool way, which I don't want to reveal if you're going to watch the movie, because if you're a cinephile, I think you'll see that as a real treat. But I think it says a lot about Kiarostami and what he's going for in certain aspects. There's certainly appreciation of the past and for art, but also all of the ways it can be interpreted and distorted. But yeah, I don't know what else to say about this movie other than it is so intricately layered, in the sense that I don't think I can give it a proper review, because it is so complicated and I haven't wrapped my head around it. Even after seeing it multiple times, it's still revealing itself to me, and that I find so intriguing. And I was so hypnotized by this film the first time I saw it, and it still has that quality, and it's a masterwork. Next, I'm going to be talking about Phoenix, and this is directed by Christian Petzold. This movie is going to be one of the more subtle movies compared to a lot of the other ones on this list, and I think, and I talked about this in my original review, I had to go back and watch it because it had been years since I had done it, but one thing that I said, and I kept talking about, is how this film is deceptively simple. It appears so effortless, and I think that is its power. It is so perfectly structured, there's not a hair out of place. Not a single line is a throwaway, not a single scene. Everything is exactly where it needs to be. and everything is essential to the whole story. The film takes on that iconic premise that was used in Vertigo, and which is an interesting one. Somebody pretending to be a role in order to please another person in a relationship. And that reveals many raw and toxic elements to both the way men view women and the way women view men. Because it's based on the romanticism that they project onto each other and what they expect each other to be, whether from social expectation or whatever. But this movie uses that concept in a way that is very much its own thing. And I like that about it. It's more using the concept in a way that is reflecting nationalism and how all of that was supposed to work in a post-war Europe. That's one aspect of it, but it's also, as I said, it's about relationships themselves and the toxicity between men and women and the lengths that we're willing to go to maintain a certain illusion, whether for the excitement or to be the person that you want the other person to see you as. And I keep thinking about the idea of illusions. I know that that's kind of a theme throughout this list. I like that sort of stuff. But that idea and the idea of like performance art, almost in a like a David Lynch sort of feel, it's always lurking in the background of this movie and maintaining the idea of, as I say, performance, and how we often fall victim to those illusions. Even the wife and the husband in this are both performers, and the movie is called Phoenix, which is the club that she sees him in. And the movie ends with a performance. I mean, really the whole movie is a performance in a sense, but I mean, it ends with an actual performance by the two of them. The premise itself is quite far-fetched in a lot of ways, but I look at this movie more as it's a suspension of disbelief sort of thing. And whether that makes sense to you or not, and whether or not you're going like, oh, come on, how can he not tell that's her? I mean, she's got the same voice, etc. But I actually think that that's part of the symbolism of the movie. It's the idea that he's probably, maybe on some level he does know it's her, but he's in denial about it. They are all in a certain denial. A denial about her and a denial about the state of their country. In the movie, just in the way that it's shot and everything, there is just a very melancholy, very poetic sort of feeling, and it's almost like a haze throughout. It's calm, but yet there's this turbulence that seems to seethe from underneath it. I think it's a movie that I said, it's so simple, yet I think that there's a lot within it. I also think it's timeless, and it does have a potential to be one of those classics that we look back on, and I don't see it being dated anytime soon. Moving right along, the next movie that is on my list is Enter the Void, and this film came out technically it came out in 2009, but it wasn't released until 2010, so it's going on the list. Because, I had to sneak in a Noe film in there. I had to. And this is the one that I'm going to go with because, as I've said, there are things about Noe, and there's certainly things that, when it comes to Enter the Void, that I struggle with. It is a very flawed movie, and it's sloppy at times. It's unnecessarily expository in sections. And yet, it's an experience like no other. And one of those movies that no matter what, when I first saw it, I didn't like it, but it kept sticking with me. And the more that I watched it, the more I have learned to respect it and even admire it and even really, really like it. I will never forget just how much it affected me. I think it was maybe the second time that I saw the movie, because it was a very different point of view I was coming from at a different point in my life. And when I did, and the visceral feeling I had was so extreme. It was like the world melted away, and I was almost I became induced. I was like wrapped up in this, whatever this was, this ride, this phantasmagoria, this fever dream. It's DMT, like drenched psychedelic world that it's exploring so much about life and about death and rebirth and procreation all in one, and how it's all tied together in this sort of cyclical way. It's a circle with no end and no beginning. It's exploring time and how time can be relative. We're all essentially trying to return to the womb, to be connected to our roots throughout our lives. I think of all the movies that Gaspar Noé has done, and he's always interesting, I think that this one is perhaps his most ambitious film. I would say visually, but also thematically, it is just so bold. I mean, he is so unafraid to push the very edges of human emotion, but especially in this one, because it's almost like he's going past it. As though you're on an acid trip. When on an acid trip, you push so far that you transcend emotion. And it becomes something new entirely. And that's almost how it feels here. Because the movie at times is so intense that you push past it to something more toxic. And yet At other times, it's so meditative that it's almost like you're being lulled to sleep. It's like soporific. You're like blending in with the experience. It's also gut-wrenching, and it's also disorienting. It's melancholy yet beautiful, yet repulsive. There's even a warning at the beginning of the movie that if you have epilepsy, maybe don't watch this movie. So yeah, there's a lot going on. There's a DMT trip actually in the movie at the very beginning. It's one of the most abrasive experiences that, yes, it's so aesthetically driven, and yet there's so much to learn about the self through that experience. So much to fall in and absorb, and it's never simple. It feels like it's right from the gut, and I appreciate that. Or maybe I should say from the womb. This movie had a similar effect to me that 2001 had, and I think obviously 2001 is a heavy influence in this film, but it did have a similar impact on me where I didn't know what I had seen. I didn't know what I felt. And it's been so exciting returning to both those films over time and realizing what it means for me. Next on my list is Boyhood, and this came out in 2014. It was directed by Richard Linklater. This movie also is very, very, very ambitious in the sense that it was shot over a 12-year period, and it's chronicling the life of a boy as he goes from being a child into adolescence and then ultimately adulthood. I do think this is one of his best movies in the last decade for sure. It's a movie that, it's similar to Waking Life in the sense that there's a lot of like existential, like philosophical musings. And we see that through all kinds of different people, through their points of view in both movies. And really there it's just like reflecting the struggle of what it means to exist, the struggle for contentment, the struggle with mortality and time and what it means to us. This movie is very reminiscent to me of something like Joan Didion's The White Album, which is actually a nonfiction written piece, and one of my favorites in the sense that it seems to be kind of commenting on the very idea of what story structure is, where it feels more like it's just capturing a period in time and all these little vignettes, little moments that she's emphasizing here and there that's creating ultimately like a mosaic. It's like just kind of little textures of life. And this movie feels that way. It's sort of defying the idea of climactic moments and the big things where the orchestra swells that we're so used to in narratives, whether it's winning a gold medal at the Olympics and having that big moment in the movie, whether it's getting married, whether it's having a kid, whatever. Those are all the big staples of life that we look to. And this film says, no, that's not all that life is about. It's about the in-between and how authentic life can unfold if you let it. And it does. This movie does feel like some great nonfiction work in the Joan Didion sense. It feels like little Polaroids or little diary entries, so that we aren't looking at the big moments and we're not even looking for them. We're just living in the moment. Even with it being shot over 12 years, there's something about that, that's not something we see often. And it is sort of a commentary on time. All that ambition completely comes full circle, and it is done with more heart and more integrity than anything I think you're likely going to see from Linklater, which is saying a lot because I think that a lot of his movies are very, very personal, and yet this one felt even more so. This is a passion project. It truly is, and it moves me to tears. It moved me so much when I saw it the first time, and I love it. I love it so much. Another film that is similar to that one, that I often think are good companion pieces and is also on this list, is Tree of Life, which came out in 2011. And that was directed by Terrence Malick. Similar to Boyhood in the sense that it has a lot of that same philosophical contemplation about existence and the meaning of life, but done in a very different way. This is a very different type of auteur. Only Terrence Malick could make a movie like this. I know a lot of people try to copy this sorts of style, but it is his style. It's a very celestial movie, very, very cosmic, where a lot of the sensory moments, the very tangible moments are focused on, very similarly to Boyhood. This has more of a spiritual feeling to it, and we're seeing a person, a child, evolve and mature. And as we're doing it, the way that the film is, it's just the camera work is so fluid, and the dialogue and everything is so fluid, and it feels almost like each moment is like a little breath or a little kiss. It's a very spiritual, very ethereal experience watching this movie. It feels almost like you're taking psilocybin mushrooms in the middle of the woods. That honestly, I think that's a good way to describe this movie. It fits with that sort of mentality. And there's something so precious about it. Even if you think it's lofty or maybe overly ambitious, some people have criticized it for being that. But I think that there's something so deeply precious and personal about it. It feels like you know, a summer night when you're a child and you're trying to capture little dragonflies and put them in a jar. It is so intimate and real, like the thumbprints of a life. They can't be recreated. When I was younger, I actually kind of agreed with a lot of that criticism, because when this movie came out, I think I was like 21 years old or something. And I remember thinking that I didn't know if I felt that the more kind of space sequences of it fit in with the story about the family. But now I feel so differently. I feel like that's so important. That's so crucial to understanding the film, because it's capturing the full range of possibility and scope. And it's also that part of perspective, again, like in a mushroom trip, almost like stepping outside of your life for a second. And I feel like looking at it, it's almost as if we're pondering that quote. And I know I'm probably going to get this wrong, but it's the whole idea of, am I part of the universe, or is the universe part of me? Is existence and the meaning of life and all of this knowledge all really represented in a little family in Texas? Perhaps. And I think the exploration of that is so remarkable. I think that this is one of the most free and most creative, special experiences you can have at the movies. And I think it is Terrence Malick at his finest, at least for this decade. It becomes transcendent ultimately, and it feels like you're watching somebody come to terms with something and accept something, and how powerful that can be, but right before their death, right before their life is about to come to a close. And there's a bitterness about that, yet such a beauty, and it gives me chills. Next, I'm going to talk about Nocturama, which came out in 2016, and that was directed by Bertrand Bonillo. And that director is perhaps one of the great discoveries I've had this decade, and I actually have 2 movies on here by him. I just think his approach to filmmaking is very unusual, and it so goes against what is typical in terms of instincts and how you would normally build tension in a sequence, or how you would build characters. There's actually little to no character development in this movie, and there's very little information to go on in terms of these people in the movie, their intent, their motivations. And yet I have no problem with the strategy of not building the characters at all, because I think that's kind of the essential core of it, and the point of what he's trying to do, or maybe explore. But he's exploring things more in a visual sense, I would say. His movies are very abstract in tone, and at times there's almost no linear coherence, and it creates a feeling that's almost psychedelic and dreamlike. It's kind of refracting. I always get a feeling of mirrors when I'm watching his movies, and you do see mirrors as a common theme. It's very dizzying, yet at the same time very controlled and very precise. It's like a chess game, and it all works together so seamlessly to create a sort of tone that's insinuating a lot about the modern world, but it never feels forced. And I think part of that is because we never really know how he feels about it, because he's never quite giving us a clear point of view. It's more what we have to interpret for ourselves. And I think that somehow the emptiness of the film, but I guess if you want to call it that, maybe the skeletal quality of the characters and all of that, I think it seems to complement that feeling really well. We don't need to know about these characters as singular types, because they are, in a way, they work together as one nucleus, as I often say when it comes to his films, when it comes to the ensemble of characters. They stand more for like a social symbol. They're like lab rats that we're watching from above. I think this movie says a lot about the millennial generation, the loneliness of it, the aimlessness of it, and certainly the disconnect. But what draws these people together, and there's a lot of things that I think you could say, but I think part of it is wanting to rebel and not really understanding why, to gain attention, not really understanding why. There's so much that they don't understand, and they're way in over their heads because of it. Destruction and sacrifice and ultimately death will be the result of their actions. And when you watch the movie, it's like they have to know that. But yet they're still so gung-ho. It's like they are leaping into the destruction, almost like they're putting on the accelerator, like it's like Thelma and Louise. There's something about that feels very sad and very lonely about this generation, about people that are so starved for attention. And the movie captures all of that through the most expertly crafted visuals and even touches of surrealism throughout. It's a very clinical approach, but it's always aware of the conceit of what it means to make a film and how that is still a manipulative tool. And that tool is really representing this community of people as though it's like a social experiment. It's so intricate in its execution, and it's one of those movies where you've got to watch it twice. Like there's no ifs, ands, or buts. You have to. I saw the movie once, and I saw it one more time right after, back to back, and that's the perfect way to do it. And I'm finally going to get to my favorite movie of the decade, and that is a Bertrand Bonillo film. It is House of Tolerance, which came out in the year 2011. It's hard to capture, I mean, it's hard to talk about all these movies, to be quite honest, because they are so great, and to talk about them in little blurbs like this is really hard. But when I think about this movie, I think a lot about what people think about me in my life, like my friends. And they, like one of my best friends said to me once, you know, I wouldn't want to watch movies the way that you do, because he doesn't like the idea of things being so analytical. So when you're so analytical like that, you do lose something. And I agree with that. You lose that immersive quality to the movie, that entertainment value. You lose the manipulation, which is what it's trying to do. Because we are more like, people like me are more like mechanics, where we want to pop the hood and look at the wheels, nuts and bolts of how something is working. I love that, and I can't imagine my life any other way. I wouldn't want to watch movies any other way, but at the same time, yeah, there is a certain loneliness to it. You do lose a lot. I look at movies, it feels a lot more like work, because I'm doing it for this purpose a lot of the time. When people want to see a movie for fun with me, it's, you know, I really have no interest. I'd rather do something else. But this is one of the few films, or I'd say of all the movies on this list, and other movies as well, because, you know, there's many great films this decade. This is the one, I think, where I relinquished my analytical nature on a first viewing, especially initial first viewing, I think more than anything else. This movie had such a profound impact on me in a way that I pretty much was speechless by the end of it. And that's rare. When I talk about this movie, when I think about it, I just think of Bertrand Bonilla, both films really, Nocturama and this film, it's the idea of mirrors kind of intercutting, and like they're kind of overlapping and cutting into each other, as though, I mean, that's just kind of his philosophy, it seems, and his technique, his aesthetic, the way he constructs his film. Like, because if somebody walks past that, you know, you're going to see that person, you know, repeatedly go through in different reflections, but each one's going to be a little distorted. The angle's going to be a little different, and your perceptions of what that person really looks like is going to be different. And there's something surreal about that. And I think that his idea of time and the logic behind time, and in terms of how it's structured in his movies, works very similarly. It is a very experimental sort of thing that he's going for here, and I think it is kind of ultimate postmodernism. There's a little bit in this movie, there's a little bit of Lynch, there's a little bit of Gaspar Noé, there's a little bit of Kubrick, but it's its own refreshing modern concoction at the same time. And even though it takes place at the very end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, it feels like it's removed from any time period at all. And almost as though it's not even in this universe at times. And again, like Nocturama, it's a different experience of watching a movie where the characters themselves are not the focus, and it's the skeletal nature of it that becomes the crux of why it works, ironically. When I said, talking about Nocturama, that it feels like one big nucleus, that's what this feels like too. It feels like you're experiencing the pure emptiness and isolation of a person, like a mind that is slowly decomposing because of their sadness. This is a film about prostitution, essentially, about a singular brothel, but it's about the romanticism of it as well as the deglamorization of it. It exposes a lot of truths behind it, and it says some complex things about romanticism, how romanticism is superficial to an extent, and yet how that superficiality starts to begin to define you. And that is through the symbol of sexuality, and how sex can define you to a point where it owns you, and then you lose that self-control. This movie to me is about that, about filling voids through sex, and how that is intertwined with the whole concept, the whole idea of what it means to be a woman, in particular a sexually active woman. And it's also intertwined with the idea of social class and what is expected of a woman, and how hard it is to break from your environment once it has seemed to define you. Wanting a sort of pleasure and wanting a sort of romanticism without the shame of carrying that identity that's projected onto you because of it. The characters in this, like, yeah, they do fit together almost like it's one stream of consciousness, as though there are waves fluctuating throughout. Nothing in this film is concrete. It feels like you're responding to feelings and impulses. It's feelings and abstraction and stuff that you're exploring within yourself. And yeah, I mean, it did it in a way that made me feel extremely vulnerable, and made me feel very sad, to be honest with you, as a woman who is very flawed and is also struggling with their sense of identity. It is the most special and maybe the most intricate, the most nuanced, one of the most creative works. It brought me to tears multiple times throughout. And, you know I'm saying that about a lot of these movies, but I don't cry very often at movies. So when I do, it really means something. But this film really evoked that from me, because it's just a tapestry of all these complex moods and emotions. But through all of it, through the pain, there is a sense of evolution and strength. When I saw this movie, though, I just remember thinking, this is what it means to truly reach your potential as an artist, as a filmmaker. In every way, this is it. Like, we're there, the end. So, yeah, I mean, how could that not be something that I'll always want to return to? And a film that I think is one of the great films of the last 10 years. But yeah, those are my favorite movies of the decade. And I realized as I was putting this list together that I've been doing this for 10 years. I've been on YouTube off and on, of course, but I started 10 years ago as a 19-year-old. And I realized at that point, I was like, holy shit, that's a long time. And I've changed a lot, obviously, as a human being, but I've changed a lot, like just in terms of my reviewing and the way that I see movies and how seriously I want to take them. And I think this channel's evolved a lot in that time, but I do enjoy doing it. It's something I do more for passion than anything else, because it's not like I get paid a huge amount or anything, but I really appreciate all of you guys for watching. And please recommend movies maybe that I haven't seen of the past 10 years and go ahead and comment. And I'm excited to see what the next 10 years bring. And maybe we'll see how long I still keep doing this. But anyway, that is the video. And if you'd like to follow any of my social media stuff, it's all down there. You can watch more videos here, and you can subscribe if you want to. Catch you next time.